1,000 years ago, on the banks of the Mississippi, a city larger than almost any settlement in North America rose from the floodplain. Its people built enormous earthen monuments, tracked the movement of the sun, traded across a continent, and gathered tens of thousands beneath the shadow of a man-made mountain. Then, within only a few generations, the metropolis emptied and its builders were nearly erased from history. Before we uncover what happened to Cahokia, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy exploring the forgotten mysteries of the human past. 1,000 years ago, before roads, warehouses, rail lines, and the bright grid of modern St. Louis, the eastern bank of the Mississippi opens into a world of water, grass, timber, and sky. The river does not hold obediently to one channel. It bends, divides, floods, retreats, and leaves behind oxbow lakes, marshes, sand ridges, and dark bands of fertile soil. In summer, heat gathers over the floodplain. In winter, cold winds sweep down the valley. During spring floods, familiar ground can vanish beneath muddy water, only to return weeks later richer than before. Somewhere within this restless landscape, people are preparing the foundations of a city unlike anything yet seen north of Mexico, though no one standing here can know what is coming. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the story begins not with monuments, but with a place that has drawn human beings for thousands of years. Archaeologists call this broad floodplain the American Bottom, a name that sounds ordinary but describes one of the most productive environments in the interior of North America. It stretches for many miles along the Mississippi beneath limestone bluffs rising to the east. The lowlands offer fish, waterfowl, turtles, mussels, deer, nuts, berries, reeds, clay, timber, and soils renewed by flooding. The uplands provide stone, hardwood forests, prairie plants, and safer ground when the river rises. Different ecological zones lie close together, allowing communities to move between them without traveling enormous distances. This abundance does not make life effortless. Floods can destroy homes. Mosquitoes thrive in standing water. Summer humidity can spoil stored food, while winter shortages punish poor planning. Yet for people who understand the rivers, the floodplain is not a wilderness waiting to be used. It is a known and inhabited world, mapped through memory, seasonal movement, kinship, and generations of experience. Human presence in the region reaches back to the closing centuries of the Ice Age, when hunters moved through a colder landscape inhabited by animals now absent from the valley. Over thousands of years, the climate warms, forests expand, and communities adapt to new plants, animals, and waterways. The people archaeologists group under labels such as Paleo-Indian, Archaic, and Woodland are not stages in a simple march towards civilization. They represent many societies, each with its own knowledge and history, most of which can only be partly reconstructed. What survives in the record suggests repeated occupation, experimentation, movement, and return. Stone tools change shape. Camps become longer-lived settlements. Plant foods are processed more intensively. Rivers become highways linking distant communities. Long before Cahokia, the Mississippi Valley already carries materials and ideas across extraordinary distances. By the Woodland period, people throughout the region are building burial mounds, organizing ceremonies, cultivating native plants, and participating in exchange networks connecting the Great Lakes, Gulf Coast, Appalachians, and Plains. Copper travels south. Marine shell moves north. fine stone crosses hundreds of miles. These objects may carry status, ancestry, ritual meaning, and relationships between communities. The famous Hopewell network centered farther east and north influence a wide world, but the people of the American bottom develop local traditions rather than simply copying distant centers. Scholars still debate how political authority operates in these earlier communities because houses, burials, and artifacts do not reveal social rules clearly. There are leaders, specialists, and ceremonial gatherings, but power may be temporary, negotiated, or shared among several families rather than concentrated in one ruler. Food production also changes slowly. For generations, people cultivate plants native to eastern North America, including sunflower, goosefoot, knotweed, and maygrass. Maize, first domesticated far to the south in Mexico, reaches the region long before it becomes the dominant crop. At first it may be rare, unfamiliar, or used only in limited settings. Then communities learn how to grow varieties suited to local seasons and soils. By the centuries before Cahokia's rise, maize becomes increasingly important. This matters because it can support dense populations when combined with careful storage, fertile land, and dependable labour. But it also creates new risks. A larger harvest can feed more people, yet dependence on fewer crops can make hunger more severe when drought, pests, or floods strike. The same system that creates abundance can make failure more dangerous. Around the floodplain, settlements appear on natural levees and raised ridges where houses stand above ordinary floods. Families build with wooden posts, woven mats, reeds, bark, and clay. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Children learn paths through marsh and woodland. Hunters return with deer. Fish are dried or cooked. People tend crops, gather fuel, shape tools, repair houses, and preserve food for lean seasons. Some villages remain small. Others grow, shrink, or move. Cemeteries and mounds bind people to particular places, while marriage and exchange bind them to communities beyond the horizon. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because later construction, farming, highways, and urban development have disturbed much of the archaeological landscape. What is visible today is only a fraction of what once existed. The location that will become Cahokia is therefore not chosen from emptiness. It sits near the meeting place of immense river systems, within reach of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois valleys. From here, travellers can move north toward the forests and copper country, west toward the plains, south toward the lower Mississippi and Gulf, or east through river corridors toward the Ohio Valley and Appalachians. The surrounding floodplain can produce remarkable quantities of food. While nearby woodlands supply fuel and building material, natural ridges offer settlement space. Waterways carry people, stories, sacred objects, and news. Perhaps just as important, generations have already made this landscape meaningful. By the early 11th century, several communities occupy the area, but none yet resembles the metropolis that will follow. Then, around the middle of that century, the archaeological record changes with startling speed. Population surges, settlements are reorganized, new buildings, plazas, and mounds reshape the ground. People arrive from outside the immediate region. Older patterns are not erased, but gathered, intensified, and redirected toward something unprecedented. No single explanation fully accounts for why this transformation begins when it does. Agricultural success, religious renewal, ambitious leadership, migration, celestial events, and political opportunity may all play a part. The American bottom supplied the stage, the resources, and the deep human history. Now the quiet settlements on its ridges are about to become the center of a new world. The transformation begins so quickly that, centuries later, it still appears almost abrupt. Around the middle of the 11th century, the scattered settlements of the American bottom start to change in scale, shape, and purpose. Houses multiply. New neighborhoods appear. Large open spaces are cleared. Earthen mounds rise where ordinary ground once stood. People arrive from beyond the immediate floodplain, bringing unfamiliar pottery styles, food traditions, and perhaps different languages. Within only a few generations, a landscape of villages becomes the largest population center north of Mexico. Archaeologists sometimes call this sudden expansion the Cahokian Big Bang, not because the city appears in a single moment, but because the evidence suggests an extraordinary burst of construction, migration, ceremony, and political reorganization around the year 1050. The settlement known today as Cahokia takes its modern name from an indigenous people who lived in the region centuries later. The original inhabitants left no surviving written name for the city, and there is no reliable record of what they called themselves. Even the word city can be misleading if it brings to mind stone streets, permanent markets, or buildings packed into a rigid grid. Cahokia is built from earth and wood. Its houses are modest by later urban standards. Yet they spread across a vast area. Its avenues are paths. Its monuments are enormous platforms of soil. Its skyline is formed by mounds, tall wooden posts, smoke, and the roofs of thousands of structures. It is urban not because it resembles Rome or a medieval European capital, but because it gathers an unprecedented concentration of people, labor, authority, ritual, and exchange into one organized center. Before the expansion, the area contains farming villages connected by kinship and trade. Then older settlements are cleared or reorganized. Some houses are dismantled. New structures are built according to plans that seem to reach beyond the needs of individual families. At the center, a great plaza begins to take form, eventually covering an area large enough to hold thousands of people. Around it, mounds rise in carefully chosen positions, residential zones spread outward, some densely occupied and others separated by open ground, ridges, wetlands, or ceremonial spaces. The city is not created by gradual unplanned growth alone. The arrangement suggests deliberate decisions made by people capable of directing labor on a large scale. Construction begins with baskets. There are no draft animals, metal shovels, or wheeled carts suited to moving soil. Workers loosen earth with digging sticks, stone tools, and wooden implements, load it into baskets, carry it by hand, and empty it at the chosen site. Each basket adds only a small amount, but repeated thousands upon thousands of times, the ground changes shape. Different kinds of soil are selected for different purposes: clay, silt, sand, and darker topsoil are layered in ways that help stabilize the mounds, though some constructions later slump or require repair. The effort represents more than raw labor. Someone must decide where to dig, where to build, how to feed the workers, and how to persuade or compel communities to participate. Cahokia's growth is closely tied to the expansion of maize agriculture. Fields spread across suitable land near the city and farther into the surrounding countryside. Maize provides dense calories and can be stored, transported, and redistributed. Yet the metropolis does not survive on maize alone. Families continue to grow native plants, gather nuts and fruits, fish the lakes and rivers, and hunt deer and smaller animals. the nearby floodplain acts as both garden and larder. Seasonal abundance supports large gatherings, while stored harvests help maintain permanent residence. Food may also become a political tool. Leaders who organize storage, feasts, and distribution can transform agricultural surplus into loyalty and prestige. Population estimates vary widely because wooden houses leave faint traces and the boundaries of the settlement shift over time. At its height, the greater Cahokia region may contain tens of thousands of people, while the central city itself supports a substantial portion of them. Even conservative estimates place it far beyond any neighbouring settlement. For someone arriving from a village of a few dozen houses, the sight must be overwhelming. Canoes move along nearby waterways. Paths converge from different directions. Smoke hangs over clusters of homes. Mounds rise above the roofs. Crowds gather in the central plaza. Ceremonies, games, feasts, and public labour bring together people who may never have met before. Migration is essential to this growth. Study of human remains suggests that many residents were not born near Cahokia. They came from other parts of the Mississippi Valley, and possibly from more distant regions. Some may have been drawn by religious excitement, marriage opportunities, access to food, trade, protection, or the prestige of living near a powerful ceremonial centre. Others may have arrived under pressure, obligation, or circumstances that remain invisible in the archaeological record. The city is therefore not the work of a single isolated tribe. It is a gathering place shaped by diverse indigenous communities, though scholars still debate how many groups were present and how differences between them were managed. One possible catalyst for Cahokia's rapid emergence is a major religious or cosmological movement. Around the time of the city's expansion, new symbols, rituals, and artistic styles spread across parts of the southeast and Midwest. Images of falcons, warriors, serpents, human figures, and sacred objects appear on shell, copper, pottery, and stone. These symbols are not identical everywhere, and their meanings cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Still, they suggest a shared ceremonial world in which Cahokia may have played an influential role. Leaders could have presented the city as a sacred centre, a place where the order of the cosmos was made visible through architecture, ritual, and public gathering. A rare celestial event may also have affected the atmosphere of the period. In July of 1054, a brilliant supernova appeared in the sky, bright enough to be seen during daylight for several weeks. Chinese astronomers recorded it, and some researchers have wondered whether North American communities also observed and interpreted it. Direct evidence connecting the event to Cahokia is lacking, and claims that particular artworks depict the supernova remain disputed. Yet even without proving a direct link, the timing invites careful attention. In societies where the sky is tied to ceremony, agriculture, and authority, an unexpected star could have carried enormous significance. It may have reinforced existing movements rather than causing them. Whatever combination of forces is at work, Cahokia becomes more than a prosperous settlement. It becomes an idea made physical. The city demonstrates that leaders can gather labour from many communities, reshape the earth, concentrate food, and create spectacles large enough to turn strangers into participants. Its rise brings opportunity, but also dependence. Thousands of people now rely on shared fields, political coordination, and stable relations between neighbourhoods and surrounding villages. The same concentration that produces power also creates vulnerability. For the moment, however, those risks remain hidden beneath new houses, expanding plazas, and the first great mounds climbing above the floodplain. The people who fill Cahokia's streets, plazas, workshops, and houses do not form a single, simple population. The city grows because individuals and families arrive from many directions, carrying different habits into the same expanding centre. Some come from nearby villages in the American bottom. Others travel from farther reaches of the Mississippi Valley, from river systems to the east and west, and perhaps from regions hundreds of miles away. Their pottery, food remains, burial customs, and biological signatures suggest movement on a scale rarely seen in earlier settlements. Cahokia is not merely a large village whose descendants stayed in place and multiplied. It is a magnet, drawing people into a new social world where old identities must be preserved, adjusted, or sometimes abandoned. Archaeologists cannot recover the names of these migrants or the reasons each person came. The city left no readable texts, royal lists, tax records, or personal letters. Its inhabitants survive through traces: a house rebuilt several times, a broken cooking vessel, a child's burial, a stone tool worn smooth, maize burned in a storage pit, or chemical patterns locked inside human teeth. Isotopic studies can sometimes distinguish people raised locally from those who spent childhood in regions with different geology. The results suggest that a significant portion of Cahokia's population was born elsewhere. Exactly how large that migrant population was remains uncertain, but the evidence changes the image of the city. Cahokia was built not by an isolated community, but by people learning how to live among strangers. Most residents occupy houses made from wooden posts set into the ground, with walls covered by woven materials and clay. Roofs are likely thatched with grass or other plant fibres. A typical household structure is small, especially compared with the open spaces and massive mounds nearby. Inside, daily life is compressed around a hearth: sleeping areas, storage containers, tools, baskets, food, and personal possessions. Houses need frequent maintenance. Posts rot in damp soil. Roofs leak. Walls crack. Some structures are rebuilt in nearly the same place, while others are deliberately abandoned or burned. These homes appear modest, yet together they represent thousands of decisions about family, labour, inheritance, and belonging. The household is probably the basic unit of production. Men, women, children, elders, and specialists contribute in different ways, though assigning exact roles by gender is difficult. Residents plant, weed, harvest, hunt, fish, gather fuel, prepare meals, make clothing, shape pottery, repair tools, carry water, care for children, and participate in ceremonies. Their work follows the seasons. Spring demands planting and rebuilding. Summer brings field labour, fishing, and the threat of heat and disease. Autumn produces intense harvest activity and opportunities for public feasting. Winter reduces some outdoor work but increases dependence on stored food, dried meat, nuts, and social cooperation. Not everyone performs the same tasks. Cahokia contains skilled artisans producing objects that require training and access to specialized materials. Craftspeople work marine shell into beads, cups, pendants, and engraved objects. Others hammer copper into thin ornaments without smelting it, using techniques based on heating, shaping, and careful finishing. Stoneworkers produce projectile points, hoes, blades, and ceremonial objects from materials brought across long distances. Potters create vessels for cooking, storage, serving, and ritual use. Some objects are ordinary and practical. Others demand so much labour that they likely signal status, religious authority, or participation in distant exchange networks. The production of stone hoes offers a revealing detail. Cahokia's dependence on maize requires fields to be cleared and worked repeatedly, and large chipped stone hoes become essential tools. Many are made from Mill Creek chert, a durable stone quarried in what is now southern Illinois. Finished tools and rough blanks travel north toward the city, where they are used until their edges become worn or polished by soil. A broken hoe may seem insignificant beside a monumental mound, yet it points toward the enormous agricultural labour hidden behind urban life. Every public feast, every construction project, and every gathering in the plaza depends on people working fields beyond the ceremonial centre. The population is likely organised into neighbourhoods with distinct social or cultural identities. Clusters of houses sometimes surround small courtyards or local mounds. Differences in pottery styles and domestic practices may reflect groups who came from different regions and settled near relatives or people with shared traditions. One especially intriguing area west of the central precinct has produced evidence interpreted as a community of immigrants, including people with ties to regions north of Cahokia. Their presence suggests that the city allowed some newcomers to maintain recognizable customs, rather than immediately becoming culturally uniform. Scholars still debate how firmly particular artifact styles can be connected to specific populations, but the broader picture is one of diversity within an organized urban landscape. That diversity may create both strength and tension. Migrants bring labor, knowledge, alliances, and new connections. They expand the city's reach and help make it a continental center, but they may also compete for land, food, marriage partners, ritual influence, and protection. Leaders must find ways to unite people who do not share the same local ancestry. Public ceremonies, communal construction, feasts, games, and shared symbols may serve this purpose. Building a mound is not only an engineering project, it can also be a social performance that turns separate households into participants in a common order. Whether that participation is voluntary, expected, or enforced probably varies across time and circumstance. Status differences are visible, though the city's social hierarchy is not fully understood. Some people are buried with rare materials, carefully arranged objects, and signs of elaborate ceremony. Others receive simpler treatment or leave almost no visible burial record. Certain houses occupy more desirable locations near mounds and plazas, while many residents live farther from the center. Access to fine shell, copper, specialized food, and ceremonial spaces is uneven. Yet Cahokia does not resemble a society divided neatly between a tiny palace elite and a uniform mass of workers. Power may be distributed among religious leaders, lineage heads, neighborhood authorities, skilled specialists, and influential families. Health also varies across the population. Human remains reveal signs of nutritional stress, infection, injury, and heavy physical labor. Maize supports population growth, but a diet too dependent on it can contribute to deficiencies if not balanced with other foods. Crowded settlement increases exposure to waste, parasites, and contaminated water. Migrants may be especially vulnerable because they lack established support networks or arrive during periods of shortage. At the same time, the city offers resources unavailable in smaller communities: access to diverse foods, craft opportunities, ceremonial prestige, and powerful social connections. Cahokia is neither simply prosperous nor uniformly harsh. Its residents experience the metropolis differently depending on age, origin, status, health, and household position. What survives in the record suggests a city held together by constant human effort. Its greatness does not rest only on rulers or monuments, but on farmers carrying harvests, artisans shaping shell, families rebuilding walls, travellers arriving by canoe, and labourers lifting baskets of earth. These people turn Cahokia from an ambitious plan into a living place. Yet their diversity raises a deeper mystery. To gather thousands is one achievement. To make them believe they belong to the same centre is another. The answer may lie in the monuments now rising above them, where political authority, sacred meaning, and the shape of the city begin to merge. At the centre of Cahokia's growing world, the ground itself begins to rise. What first appears to be an ordinary elevation becomes, through years of repeated labour, a massive earthen platform dominating the floodplain. Today it is known as Monk's Mound, named centuries later after a group of Trappist monks who lived nearby, but the people who built it left no surviving record of its original name. Even stripped of that name, the monument remains unmistakable. It is the largest human-made earthen structure in the Americas north of Mexico, covering roughly 14 acres at its base and rising about 30 meters above the surrounding land. Its broad terraces and flattened summit are not the result of a single construction event. They are the accumulated outcome of planning, repair, expansion, and the movement of an almost unimaginable quantity of soil. The mound does not rise from stone blocks fitted into place, nor from bricks carried on wheeled carts. It is built one basket at a time. Workers dig earth from nearby borrow pits using wooden and stone tools, loosen heavy soil, load it into containers, and carry it to the construction zone on their backs or shoulders. A basket may hold only a modest amount. To build a monument containing hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth requires millions of such journeys. The labour is repetitive, exhausting and vulnerable to heat, rain, mud, insects, and injury. Yet the work continues across generations. Cahokia's builders do not possess metal shovels, draft animals, or machinery, but they have something equally important: organised human effort sustained long enough to change the landscape. The mound's internal structure shows that its builders understand soil in practical, highly developed ways. They do not simply heap loose dirt into a giant pile. Layers of clay, sand, silt, and topsoil are placed in different areas, sometimes to create firm surfaces, sometimes to improve drainage, and sometimes to shape new terraces over earlier construction. Different soils leave distinct colours and textures within the mound, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct stages of building long after the original surfaces have disappeared. Some layers represent major expansions, others appear to be repairs after slumping or erosion. What survives in the record suggests constant adjustment rather than a flawless design executed once. The earliest mound beneath the later structure is smaller and less imposing. As Cahokia's population and authority expand, new stages cover and enlarge the old ones. The summit rises, terraces widen, and the entire monument becomes more visible from the central plaza and surrounding neighbourhoods. This process may have been as important as the finished structure. Each rebuilding campaign creates an opportunity to gather labour, distribute food, hold ceremonies, and display leadership. The mound is not merely an object completed in the past. It is a continuing project that demands participation and reminds the population that the city's centre is still growing. Organising such labour requires coordination far beyond the household. Workers must be recruited from neighbourhoods and surrounding communities. Digging areas must be selected. Paths must be kept clear. Baskets, tools, food, and water must be supplied. Construction has to fit around planting and harvest cycles, because the same people carrying soil may also be responsible for producing the maize that feeds the city. Leaders cannot simply remove thousands of workers from their fields indefinitely without risking shortage. Large building episodes may therefore occur during periods when agricultural demands are lower, or they may be linked to communal gatherings when people arrive with food contributions and remain for ceremonies. Whether the labour is voluntary is harder to determine. People may work because they believe the mound is sacred, because their kin group owes service, because participation brings prestige, or because political authorities demand it. These motives are not mutually exclusive. In many societies, labour for a monument can be both obligation and devotion. A person may carry earth because refusal carries consequences, while also believing the work maintains cosmic order or honours powerful ancestors. No single explanation fully accounts for how Cahokia's leaders mobilise such numbers, but the scale of Monk's Mound makes clear that they possess extraordinary influence. The soil itself may come from areas that later become ponds, depressions, or open spaces. Some borrow pits are visible in the landscape, though modern construction and farming have altered many of them. Moving earth from one place to another does more than create a mound. It reshapes drainage, creates wetlands, changes walking routes, and transforms the appearance of the city. The builders are therefore engineering an entire ceremonial landscape, even when their methods occasionally produce unintended problems. Water is one of the greatest threats. Rain seeps into the mound. Heavy clay traps moisture. Slopes slump. Sections collapse or spread outward under their own weight. Archaeological investigations reveal evidence of such failures. Cracks and unstable zones appear within parts of the monument, and later builders respond by adding fill, changing slopes, and reinforcing damaged areas. This is a lesser-known side of Cahokia's greatest achievement. Monk's Mound is not a perfectly stable structure created by builders who never miscalculated. It is an ambitious monument whose enormous weight repeatedly tests the limits of earthen construction. Its survival depends not only on initial skill, but on continued maintenance. The mound endures because people keep returning to repair it. At the summit, large wooden buildings once stand above the city. Post holes indicate substantial structures, including one that may have measured more than 30 meters in length. Its precise purpose remains uncertain. It could have served as a residence for a powerful leader, a council house, a temple, a ceremonial hall, or some combination of these. From the top, occupants would look across the great plaza, neighbouring mounds, residential districts, fields, wetlands, and distant bluffs. The elevation turns physical height into social distinction. People below see the building silhouetted against the sky, while those above occupy a space separated from ordinary life. Access to the summit may have been controlled. A ramp or stairway probably climbed the southern face, connecting the plaza to the upper terraces. Processions moving upward would have been visible to crowds below. The journey itself could dramatize rank, sacred authority, or transformation. Yet the exact ceremonies performed there remain unknown. Archaeologists can identify burned surfaces, rebuilt structures, post patterns, and deposits, but they cannot fully recover belief from architecture. Scholars still debate whether Cahokia was ruled by a single dominant leader, several competing elites, or a changing coalition of powerful lineages. Monk's Mound supports all of these possibilities more easily than it settles them. Its greatest message may have required no explanation. Anyone approaching Cahokia would see an artificial mountain rising from flat country, a structure made entirely by human hands. It announces that the people at the center can command labor, resources, and time on a scale no nearby settlement can match. It also suggests that the city is not adapting passively to the landscape. Cahokia is remaking the landscape into an expression of authority. But monuments do more than display power. They concentrate memory. Each terrace covers earlier surfaces, older buildings, and the labor of previous generations. The mound becomes a layered history of the city itself, growing as Cahokia grows and requiring repair as the society around it changes. Beneath every summit building lie countless baskets of earth, carried by people whose names are lost. Their work gives the city its most enduring form, and from that elevated center, the rulers and ritual specialists of Cahokia begin to arrange not only the ground below, but the larger order of space, season, ceremony, and sky. From the summit of Monk's Mound, Cahokia does not look like a settlement that has spread at random. Its great plazas, mounds, neighborhoods, paths, and timber structures appear arranged according to ideas larger than convenience alone. The central precinct is built around open space, elevation, direction, and controlled visibility. Certain places are raised above others. Certain approaches guide movement toward the ceremonial core. Buildings and monuments face particular lines across the horizon. The city seems to turn geography into meaning, as though the floodplain itself has been measured, divided, and placed within a sacred order. Yet the exact principles behind that order remain uncertain, because Cahokia's builders left no written explanation of how they understood the sky, the land, or the relationship between them. The enormous Grand Plaza south of Monk's Mound is one of the clearest signs of deliberate planning. It covers dozens of acres and is unusually level for a natural floodplain. Archaeological evidence suggests that parts of the area may have been filled, cleared, and maintained to create a vast open surface. This is not empty land accidentally left between neighborhoods. It is a constructed space, large enough to hold public ceremonies, games, markets, political gatherings, feasts, or performances involving thousands of people. Its openness makes crowds visible and manageable. Individuals entering the plaza are surrounded by monumental mounds, while the towering central platform dominates the northern edge. The architecture places ordinary people below and central authority above without requiring a spoken command. Open space is essential to the experience of Cahokia. The plazas provide room for movement, but they also create distance. A mound viewed across a broad cleared area appears larger and more imposing than the same structure surrounded by houses. Processions can cross the plaza in full view. Ritual specialists can emerge from elevated buildings. Groups from different neighborhoods can occupy assigned areas while still participating in a shared event. The city's design therefore shapes behavior. It tells people where to gather, where to look, and which places are not part of everyday domestic life. Several plazas may have existed around the central core, each associated with groups of mounds and important buildings. Some researchers interpret the overall layout as reflecting 4 directions or divisions of the world, with Monk's Mound positioned near the organizing center. Similar concepts of ordered directions appear in many later indigenous traditions across North America, although direct continuity cannot simply be assumed. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeological plans can tempt modern observers to find perfect geometry where the ancient landscape was more complicated. Even so, Cahokia's repeated use of orientation, symmetry, and central open spaces strongly suggest that architecture carried cosmological as well as practical meaning. The most famous evidence for Cahokia's attention to the sky lies west of Monk's Mound, where archaeologists discovered circles of large wooden posts. These structures are popularly known as Woodhenge, a modern name inspired by Stonehenge, though the comparison can be misleading. Cahokia's circles are made from timber rather than stone, and they belong to a different cultural world. Several rings appear to have been built at different times, each composed of upright posts arranged around a central point. The largest may have contained dozens of posts and measured hundreds of feet across. Because wood decays, nothing remained above ground when the structures were found. Their former presence was revealed through dark stains in the soil where massive posts had once stood. Reconstructing such a circle requires considerable effort. Trees must be selected, felled with stone tools, trimmed, transported, and raised into deep post holes. A single large post may demand coordinated teams. The circle must also be measured with care if its positions are intended to mark consistent lines across the horizon. These were not casual fences. They represent repeated communal investments in a structure that may have functioned as a calendar, ceremonial enclosure, meeting place, or symbol of cosmic order. From the center of at least one timber circle, certain posts align approximately with the rising sun at important points in the year. One line appears to indicate the equinox sunrise near Monk's Mound, while others may correspond to the summer and winter solstices. Standing at the center before dawn, an observer could watch the sun rise beside or behind a designated post, marking the changing season. This would be useful in a farming society, but the practical value should not be separated from ritual significance. Seasonal knowledge is not merely a technical matter. The timing of planting, harvesting, ceremonies, travel, and public gatherings can all be tied to the movement of the sun. The equinox alignment toward Monk's Mound is particularly striking because it may cause the sun to rise in visual association with the city's greatest monument. To an assembled crowd, a leader or ritual specialist standing on the mound could appear connected to the solar cycle and the renewal of time. Whether this effect was deliberately staged remains debated, but Cahokia's planners clearly understood how monuments change the horizon. A mound is not only something seen from nearby, it becomes a fixed point against which the sky itself can be observed. The timber circles were rebuilt more than once, and their sizes changed. This suggests that they were not simply permanent instruments constructed and then forgotten. Rebuilding may have renewed their sacred force, corrected alignments, responded to political change, or allowed new leaders to associate themselves with the ordering of time. Old posts may have been removed ceremonially. New rings may have absorbed or replaced earlier meanings. What survives in the record suggests a tradition of repeated construction rather than a single experiment in observation. Other alignments within the city have attracted more speculative interpretations. Some researchers have proposed lunar patterns, geometric grids, or relationships between specific mounds and distant landscape features. A few of these ideas are plausible, while others rely on selecting lines after the fact from a very large number of possible points. With dozens of mounds and buildings, chance alignments are inevitable. Scholars still debate which patterns reflect deliberate planning and which are modern projections. The safest conclusion is not that Cahokia follows one perfect celestial blueprint, but that its builders repeatedly use direction, horizon, elevation, and seasonal observation in meaningful ways. The city's architecture may also reflect a division between upper and lower worlds. Raised mounds connect leaders, ancestors, or sacred buildings with the sky, while pits, borrow areas, wetlands, and water features may carry associations with realms beneath the surface. The flat plaza lies between them, occupied by the living community. Similar layered cosmologies appear in later indigenous traditions, where birds, storms, serpents, water, earth, and celestial forces belong to interconnected domains. Archaeologists must be cautious when using later traditions to interpret earlier sites. Yet the symbols found at Cahokia frequently point toward a universe alive with movement between sky, earth, and water. This gives the city a deeper purpose. Cahokia is not planned only to house a population or display wealth. Its central spaces may be intended to make the structure of the universe visible on the ground. The mound becomes a mountain. The plaza becomes an ordered human world. The timber circle captures the movement of the sun. Processions trace meaningful paths. Seasonal ceremonies renew the connection between people, harvests, leaders, ancestors, and celestial forces. Such a system can unite a diverse population because it offers more than political obedience. It gives residents a place inside a larger pattern. Migrants from distant communities may arrive with different local customs, but they can gather beneath the same rising sun, work on the same monuments, and participate in ceremonies tied to the same agricultural year. At the same time, those who control the calendar, the summit, and the central plaza gain unusual power. They do not merely organize labor, they appear to organize time itself, and that authority soon reaches into feasts, rituals, burials, and the distribution of everything the metropolis needs to survive. Cahokia's monuments dominate the skyline, but the city's survival depends on landscapes beyond the plazas. Every mound, ceremony, workshop, and household rests on a quieter achievement, feeding a dense population through changing seasons in a floodplain that is both generous and unpredictable. The metropolis cannot live from spectacle alone. It needs maize carried in baskets, fish pulled from backwaters, deer taken from forests, nuts gathered in autumn, and stores protected against rot, insects, theft, and flood. Food leaves fainter traces than earthworks, yet without it, the city would collapse within weeks. Maize becomes the backbone of Cahokia's food system. By the 11th century, farmers in the American bottom cultivate it intensively on fertile soils near the city and across surrounding settlements. The crop produces high yields, can be dried, stored, ground, boiled, or carried, and can support large gatherings when harvests succeed. Fields must be cleared, planted, weeded, guarded, harvested, and processed, requiring coordinated labor over many months. Stone hoes from southern Illinois cut into the soil, while wooden tools and human hands do the rest. There are no animal-drawn plows. Every field represents physical work. Dependence on maize does not mean older foods disappear. Native crops such as sunflower, goosefoot, knotweed, squash, and maygrass remain important, providing oils, seeds, vitamins, and variety. Some are cultivated deliberately, others are encouraged around disturbed ground and field edges. Hickory nuts, walnuts, acorns, berries, persimmons, and wild greens add seasonal resources. The floodplain's mixture of woodland, prairie, marsh, and river creates a diet more diverse than rows of maize might suggest. What survives in the record points not to one crop replacing everything else, but to a broad strategy increasingly organized around maize. Water supply is another major portion of the diet. The Mississippi and its surrounding lakes hold catfish, drum, buffalo fish, gar, paddlefish, and smaller species. Nets, hooks, traps, spears, and communal fishing methods can produce large catches, especially when shrinking waters concentrate fish. Mussels are gathered from riverbeds and backwaters. Turtles and waterfowl add to the floodplain's abundance. Some foods are eaten fresh, while others may be dried or smoked. Archaeologists find fish bones and shell in household deposits, though preservation often hides the true scale of consumption. Deer remain the most important large game animal, providing meat, hides, sinew, antler, bone, and tools. Hunting occurs in nearby forests and uplands, but population pressure may force hunters to travel farther over time. Smaller mammals, birds, and turkeys supplement the diet. Cahokia's demand transforms hunting into part of a regional network. Meat can move toward the city from less densely populated villages, while finished goods, ceremonial objects, or political obligations move outward. Scholars still debate how centralized this exchange was. Some food may have been collected as tribute, some brought by relatives, and some exchanged through feasting and alliance. Storage turns seasonal abundance into urban security. Maize and seeds can be kept in pits, baskets, containers, or raised structures if protected from moisture and pests. An autumn harvest must last through winter and into the next planting season. Storage allows households and leaders to plan ceremonies, support workers, and survive temporary shortages. Yet it also creates inequality and risk. Whoever controls large reserves gains influence over those who have less. A damaged storehouse, mold outbreak, or flood can destroy months of labor. The evidence remains incomplete, but Cahokia's population density makes organized surplus essential. Public feasting is one way surplus becomes authority. Large gatherings require food, fuel, vessels, and labor. Animals are butchered, maize is prepared in bulk, and special foods may be served to guests, workers, or ritual participants. Feasts create generosity, but also obligation. A leader who feeds hundreds demonstrates access to resources and the ability to mobilize networks beyond a single household. Participation can bind migrants and local families into a common order. The meal becomes a performance of power, though it may also be a genuine celebration of harvest, renewal, or alliance. Unusual deposits of animal bones, broken serving vessels, and concentrated plant remains suggest that some events differ sharply from ordinary domestic meals. Pottery vessels allow food to be cooked, stored, and presented at different scales. Salt, not abundant in the immediate floodplain, may arrive through trade from saline springs in nearby regions. It improves flavor and preservation, making it valuable where food must move and last. Even a common meal can depend on distant materials and maintained routes. The surrounding countryside is not separate from Cahokia. Smaller villages and farmsteads form part of the Metropolis's support system. Some residents may move seasonally between the centre and outlying fields. Others live permanently outside the core while contributing crops, game, labour, or ceremonial attendance. Cahokia's true food base extends far beyond its visible mounds. Canoes and footpaths carry produce inward, while tools, ornaments, messages, and political demands travel outward. The city's size is therefore a regional achievement, not merely a local one. This system also places pressure on the environment. More fields mean more clearing. More cooking means more firewood. More houses require more timber, wetlands are used intensively, and nearby game populations may decline. Fields cultivated repeatedly can lose productivity unless communities shift locations, manage soils, or open new land. Floods may renew fertility, but they can also ruin crops at the worst moment. Drought is equally dangerous when many households depend on the same seasonal pattern. No single explanation fully accounts for Cahokia's later difficulties, but its food system contains a basic tension. Concentration creates efficiency and power while multiplying the consequences of failure. Human health records that tension. Maize provides calories, but heavy dependence on it can contribute to nutritional imbalance and dental problems if diets become less varied. Crowded conditions increase contamination around water sources and waste areas. Children may show signs of stress during shortages or weaning, yet the city also offers access to foods and networks unavailable to isolated households. Some residents eat well, especially those linked to powerful families or ceremonial institutions. Others carry the physical cost of producing and transporting surplus. At its height, Cahokia succeeds in feeding more people than any nearby society has gathered before. That achievement requires knowledge of rivers, seasons, soils, plants, animals, preservation, and obligation. It is the conversion of a whole region into an urban support system. Fields, fishing grounds, hunting territories, storage pits, kitchens, and feast spaces become parts of the same living machine. At the centre stand those who claim the right to organise abundance, distribute it, and turn nourishment into loyalty. The next mystery is not whether Cahokia has leaders, but how those leaders make authority feel sacred enough to endure. The authority concentrated at Cahokia's centre does not operate through walls, soldiers, or written laws alone. It is performed in public, renewed through ceremony, and embedded in the city's most important spaces. Leaders stand above crowds on platform mounds. Ritual specialists track seasonal changes, prepare sacred objects, and oversee events whose meanings are shared by thousands but preserved in no surviving text. Feasts turn stored food into obligation. Burials transform death into political memory. Monument building draws households into collective labour. At Cahokia, power is most effective when it appears to be part of the natural and cosmic order, rather than merely the will of powerful individuals. Who these leaders are remains one of the city's central mysteries. Cahokia may have been ruled by a paramount chief whose authority extended across the metropolis and surrounding settlements. It may instead have been governed by several elite lineages, councils, religious offices, or competing neighbourhood authorities. These systems could also have changed over time. A single charismatic leader may have helped drive the rapid expansion around 1050, while later generations inherited institutions that became more divided or difficult to maintain. Archaeology reveals differences in burial treatment, architecture, diet, and access to rare materials, but it does not provide a clear list of offices or titles. Scholars still debate whether Cahokia's government resembled a centralized kingdom, a sacred chiefdom, a coalition of communities, or something for which modern political labels are inadequate. Whatever its exact structure, leadership is closely connected to ceremony. The summit of a mound separates certain people from ordinary domestic space. A building raised high above the plaza becomes a place where political decisions can appear sacred. Entry may be restricted by status, family, age, or ritual preparation. From below, the people gathered in the plaza see figures moving against the sky, framed by architecture and elevation. The physical arrangement itself communicates hierarchy. Those at the top command attention before they speak or act. Ceremonies likely follow seasonal cycles tied to planting, harvest, hunting, warfare, renewal, and the movement of the sun. Some gatherings may last for days, drawing visitors from surrounding villages and distant allied communities. Canoes arrive carrying food, gifts, raw materials, and participants. Temporary shelters appear around the city. Cooking fires multiply. Drums, rattles, dancing, games, processions, and formal exchanges may fill the plazas. Although the precise sounds and sequences are lost, what survives in the record suggests events large enough to reshape ordinary life and reinforce Cahokia's position as a destination rather than simply a place of residence. Feasting is one of the most powerful tools available to leaders. Providing food demonstrates abundance, generosity, and control over networks of production. Yet a feast is never free in the political sense. Guests remember who fed them. Communities that contribute maize, meat, pottery, fuel, or labor become part of a system of reciprocal obligation. A leader gives publicly and gains authority in return. The more spectacular the gathering, the more distant the ruler appears from ordinary households, even though the entire performance depends on their work. Special foods may distinguish ceremonial meals from everyday eating. Large animals can be butchered in concentrated events. Unusual plants, carefully prepared drinks, or imported ingredients may be reserved for particular participants. Black drink, a caffeinated beverage made from Yupon holly and known from later ceremonies in the southeast, has been identified through chemical evidence in vessels from Cahokia's broader cultural world. Yupon does not grow naturally near the city, meaning it must travel hundreds of miles from the Gulf Coast or southern regions. Its presence reveals that ritual consumption could depend on long-distance exchange. The beverage may have been used for purification, endurance, diplomacy, or elite ceremony, though its exact role at Cahokia remains uncertain. Objects also carry authority. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast is carved into cups, beads, pendants, and engraved ornaments. Copper from the Great Lakes is hammered into plates and decorative forms. Rare stone is shaped into ceremonial blades or figures. Bright pigments alter bodies, buildings, and burial deposits. These materials are valuable not merely because they travel far, but because distance can increase their sacred significance. An object from the sea, the northern forests, or a distant quarry may seem to carry the power of that place. Leaders who control such objects present themselves as people connected to a world larger than the floodplain. Symbolic imagery appearing across the Mississippian world provides clues to the ideas behind this authority. Falcons and other birds may be associated with the sky, warfare, speed, and elevated power. Serpentine or underwater creatures may represent forces connected to water, fertility, danger, and the world beneath the earth. Human figures wear elaborate headdresses, carry weapons, dance, or appear in postures of ritual importance. Hand and eye motifs, crosses within circles, and other repeated designs suggest a shared visual language. Modern scholars sometimes group these images under broad terms such as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, but the label can hide significant regional differences. The symbols did not necessarily mean the same thing everywhere or remain unchanged for centuries. Games may also connect ritual, diplomacy, and political competition. Chunky, known from later indigenous societies and strongly associated with Mississippian sites, is played by rolling a polished stone disc while participants throw long spears or poles toward the point where they expect it to stop. Large numbers of chunky stones have been found at Cahokia and related settlements. The game may attract spectators, gambling, rivalry, and ceremonial significance. It allows different communities to compete within agreed rules rather than through open conflict. Although competition could still sharpen political divisions, a successful player might become a figure of prestige far beyond his household. Public ritual does not eliminate coercion. Authority presented as sacred can demand labor, tribute, military service, or obedience. Communities may participate because they believe, because they benefit, because their relatives are involved, or because refusal is dangerous. Cahokia's leaders may use ceremonies to resolve disputes and distribute resources, but they may also use them to justify unequal access to food, land, objects, and honoured burial. The same plaza that unites thousands can display who stands at the centre and who remains at the edge. Evidence of warfare appears in Cahokia's artistic world through weapons, warrior imagery, and themes of sacrifice or heroic violence. Yet it is difficult to determine how frequently the city fights external enemies or uses force internally. Fortifications appear around the central precinct during later periods, suggesting increasing concern with defence or social division. Earlier authority may rely more heavily on attraction and religious prestige, while later leaders turn toward boundaries and protection as unity weakens. No single explanation fully accounts for this change, but sacred power is rarely separate from the possibility of violence. The dead are especially important in maintaining authority. Elite burials connect living leaders to ancestors, sacred histories, and claims over place. A carefully arranged grave beneath a mound can become the foundation for ceremonies continuing long after the person's death. Burial objects, sacrificed animals, pigments, and human attendants may transform an individual into more than a remembered leader. The mound above becomes a permanent statement that certain lives carry greater political and spiritual weight than others. Cahokia's system therefore rests on a delicate fusion. Leaders organize practical necessities such as labor, food, exchange, and security, but they present that organization through ceremony, celestial timing, sacred imagery, and ancestral power. As long as harvests arrive, feasts impress, monuments grow, and rituals appear effective, authority can seem woven into the structure of the world. But sacred systems face a dangerous test when suffering increases or promises fail. Beneath one of Cahokia's mounds, archaeologists will eventually uncover evidence suggesting that the maintenance of order may have demanded a price far darker than communal labour or tribute. Beneath a modest rise south of Cahokia's central precinct, the fusion of sacred authority and human cost becomes disturbingly visible. The mound is not enormous. Compared with Monk's Mound, it could almost disappear into the surrounding landscape. Archaeologists know it as Mound 72, and its outward appearance gives little warning of what lies below. When excavations begin in the 20th century, researchers uncover a complicated sequence of posts, pits, burials, rebuilt surfaces, and smaller mounds combined into one larger monument. More than 250 people are eventually identified within it. Some appear to have received careful, honoured treatment. Others were placed in mass graves, arranged in groups, or killed shortly before burial. The discovery offers one of the clearest glimpses of Cahokia's hierarchy. but it also produces interpretations that have changed dramatically as old assumptions are tested against new evidence. The history of the site begins before the final mound is constructed. Large wooden posts once stood in the area, perhaps marking a ceremonial space or an important alignment. Several smaller mounds were then built and gradually joined together. Burials accumulated through a series of events rather than one single funeral. This matters because Mound 72 does not record a brief moment of violence. It preserves repeated ceremonies carried out over time, possibly linked to the deaths of important people, the dedication of monuments, or the renewal of political authority. The most famous burial lies near the centre. When first excavated, it appeared to contain an elite man placed on a platform or bed covered with thousands of marine shell beads. The beads seemed to form the shape of a falcon or bird, with the body positioned where the bird's head would be. Because falcon imagery elsewhere in the Mississippian world is associated with warfare, the sky, and heroic power, the burial became known as the resting place of a birdman ruler for decades. Reconstructions showed a powerful male leader lying alone above a sacrificed companion, wrapped in the symbols of a warrior cult. Later analysis complicates that image. Improved examination of skeletal remains indicates that the central burial probably included both a man and a woman, along with additional individuals nearby. The arrangement of the beads may not represent a bird at all. They may have formed a decorated cloak, blanket, or garment whose original shape was altered as the bodies and surrounding materials decayed. This reinterpretation does not make the burial less important, but it changes what it can support. The evidence no longer fits neatly with the idea of one supreme male warrior ruling Cahokia. It may instead point toward paired authority, a sacred couple, a lineage group, or a ceremonial relationship between male and female figures. The revision is a reminder of how easily archaeological evidence can be shaped by expectation. Early researchers were working within a broader model that emphasized male chiefs, warfare, and centralized rule. Once the shell beads were seen as a falcon, every detail seemed to confirm that conclusion. Yet bodies do not always preserve clearly, and burial deposits can shift underground. Scholars still debate the exact identities and relationships of the central individuals. What survives in the record suggests extraordinary status, but not the simple royal portrait once imagined. Around these honoured dead are burials of a very different character. In one pit, more than 50 young women were placed together. Most appear to have been in their teens or 20s. Their bodies were arranged in orderly layers, with little evidence of the rich offerings granted to the central figures. Early interpretations describe them as sacrificed attendants, perhaps killed to accompany an elite person into death. Their similar ages raise speculation that they had been selected for appearance, fertility, ceremonial identity, or membership in a particular social group. Some researchers propose that they came from outside Cahokia as tribute or captives. Scientific studies have not produced a single clear answer. Analyses of teeth and bones suggest that at least some of these women may have grown up locally, while others could have come from different regions. Their final meals and physical histories do not identify why they were chosen. They may have been ritual specialists, household dependents, captives, migrants, or members of a particular community. The evidence remains incomplete, and labels such as servant or sacrifice can hide lives that archaeology cannot recover. What is clear is that their burial treatment sharply separates them from the honoured individuals nearby. Another grave contains men and women who appear to have died violently. Some were thrown or placed into a pit without the careful arrangement seen elsewhere. Several show injuries consistent with execution, while the positions of other skeletons have been interpreted as evidence that some victims were still alive when covered. These conclusions must be approached cautiously because pressure, decay, and the movement of soil can distort bodies after burial. Even so, the overall deposit strongly indicates organized killing rather than an ordinary cemetery. The victims were not random casualties scattered after battle. Their deaths were incorporated into a controlled ceremonial event. Other groups within the mound received more formal treatment. Men were buried with weapons or objects suggesting status. Bundles of bones may represent people who died elsewhere and were later brought to the site. Some graves contain valuable materials, including shell beads, copper, stone points, and carefully prepared offerings. The contrast is severe. Within the same monument, certain individuals are elevated through elaborate ritual, while others become part of the ritual itself. Human sacrifice is known from several complex societies, but identifying it archaeologically is difficult. Violent death does not automatically mean ceremonial killing, and mass burial can result from warfare, disease, or catastrophe. At Mound 72, however, the combination of selected populations, organized placement, association with elite burials, and repeated ceremonial construction makes sacrifice the most widely accepted interpretation for at least some of the dead. The motives remain less certain. The killings may have accompanied funerals, dedicated sacred buildings, renewed alliances, displayed victory over enemies, or demonstrated the authority of leaders over life and death. The scale is disturbing, but it should not be used to reduce Cahokia to a society defined only by cruelty. Most of its history is recorded in houses, tools, food remains, craft production, and communal construction rather than mass graves. Nor should sacrifice be treated as evidence that the city's people were uniquely violent. Political and religious systems across the ancient world have demanded human lives, often while producing art, knowledge, cooperation, and social stability. Cahokia contains the same contradiction, extraordinary collective achievement existing beside profound inequality and controlled violence. Mound 72 reveals that sacred authority was not merely symbolic. It could reach into households, select bodies, organize death, and transform victims into foundations for political memory. Yet the monument also weakens the simplest image of Cahokia as a kingdom ruled by one warrior chief. Its paired burials, changing interpretations, and multiple ceremonial episodes suggest a more complicated system of authority. The mound provides evidence of power while refusing to identify precisely who held it. Above the graves, soil eventually covered every distinction. Beads shifted, wooden structures vanished, and the names of both honored dead and victims disappeared. Only the arrangement remained, waiting beneath the grass. What archaeologists uncovered was not a complete explanation, but a warning that Cahokia's brilliance carried shadows. Beyond the mound, however, the city's influence was spreading along rivers and trade routes, carrying its objects, symbols, and political ambitions far beyond the floodplain. Cahokia's influence does not stop at the edge of the American bottom. From the city's river landings and surrounding settlements, canoes move outward along the Mississippi and into the great branching waterways of the continent. Some carry food, timber, stone, pottery, or travelers. Others carry objects whose value comes from places far beyond the floodplain: copper from the Great Lakes, marine shell from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, stone from distant quarries, and pigments collected from specialized sources. The city stands near one of North America's most important natural crossroads, where rivers connect forests, plains, wetlands, and southern coasts. Cahokia's rise turns that geography into a network of exchange with the metropolis near its centre. The Mississippi functions as a road wider and more efficient than any path through woodland. A canoe can transport heavy loads that would be exhausting to carry overland. Travellers moving downstream benefit from the current, while those returning north use side channels, poles, paddles, portages, and accumulated knowledge of the river. The journey is not easy. Floods alter channels, storms rise quickly, and hidden snags can overturn a loaded vessel. Yet indigenous communities have navigated these waters for generations. Cahokia does not create long-distance exchange, but it expands, redirects, and intensifies older routes. Marine shell is among the clearest signs of these distant connections. Large shells from the Gulf of Mexico travel hundreds of miles inland before reaching Cahokia. There, craftspeople cut, drill, polish, and engrave them into beads, pendants, cups, and ceremonial ornaments. Shell has practical qualities, but its importance likely extends beyond appearance. It comes from a distant watery world and carries the pale brightness of something rare. In cosmologies where rivers, seas, the sky, and the world beneath the earth are connected, shell may possess meanings that cannot be reduced to wealth alone. Some shell objects remain at Cahokia, especially in elite burials and ceremonial deposits. Others move outward from the city, spreading into communities across the Mississippi Valley and southeast. Their distribution suggests that Cahokia is not simply consuming imported materials. It is transforming them into objects that carry Cahokian styles, symbols, and relationships. A shell cup engraved near the Metropolis may later be used in a ceremony far away, linking its owner to the power and prestige of the great city even if that person never visits it. Copper follows a different route. Much of it originates around the Great Lakes, where naturally occurring copper can be collected without mining deep underground. It travels south through chains of exchange until it reaches Cahokia and related centres. Artisans hammer the metal into thin sheets, ornaments, plates, and symbolic forms. Because copper can be shaped without being melted, its use does not require smelting technology. Even so, producing a finished piece demands patience and skill. The metal must be heated, hammered, cooled, and worked repeatedly to prevent cracking. Copper shines like fire in sunlight and changes colour as it ages. Its visual power may help explain its ceremonial importance. It appears in elite context rather than ordinary households, suggesting controlled access. Some copper objects may be displayed on clothing, headdresses, wooden items, or ritual equipment. Their presence connects Cahokia to northern landscapes many days or weeks away. Leaders who acquire and redistribute such materials demonstrate not only wealth, but reach. They show that their alliances extend beyond the horizon. Stone also reveals the city's continental connections. Mill Creek Chert from southern Illinois supplies large agricultural hoes, while other varieties of flint and stone arrive from different regions for tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects: red pipestone, quartz crystal, sandstone, and fine materials selected for unusual colour or texture may carry specialised meanings. The distance an object travels does not always determine its value. Some locally available materials can be sacred. While distant stone may be prized for practical qualities, archaeologists must therefore avoid treating every imported object as luxury trade in a modern commercial sense. Exchange at Cahokia is not organized through coins, prices, or permanent merchant institutions recognizable from later states. Materials may move as gifts, tribute, marriage payments, diplomatic offerings, religious donations, gambling stakes, or obligations between kin groups. A canoe arriving with shell may return carrying pottery, maize, tools, cloth, stories, or promises. Some exchanges are probably direct, while others pass through many communities before reaching the city. The evidence rarely reveals the exact transaction. What survives in the record shows movement, but not always the social rules that made movement possible. People travel with the objects: ritual specialists, craftspeople, political representatives, marriage partners, captives, pilgrims, and adventurers may all pass through Cahokia. Some stay for a season, others settle permanently. Their presence helps explain the mixture of pottery styles and household traditions found in the metropolis. It also allows Cahokian ideas to spread outward through personal experience rather than through objects alone. A visitor who attends a great feast, witnesses ceremonies in the plaza, or sees Monk's Mound against the rising sun may return home carrying a powerful memory of the city. Cahokia's artistic and ceremonial influence appears across a broad region, but it is not copied uniformly. Communities adopt some symbols while rejecting or reshaping others. Falcon imagery, chunky stones, shell cups, copper ornaments, and distinctive pottery forms appear at distant sites, yet local traditions remain strong. The spread of similar objects does not prove that Cahokia rules all the places where they are found. Political control across hundreds of miles would be difficult to maintain without roads, writing, standing armies, or permanent administrative systems. Scholars still debate whether Cahokia created a loose sphere of influence, a religious movement, a diplomatic network, colonies, or several overlapping relationships. There is stronger evidence that some settlements near and beyond the American bottom were founded or reorganized by people connected to Cahokia. At sites in what are now Wisconsin and other parts of the Midwest, pottery and architectural practices show clear Cahokian influence. One remarkable settlement near modern Madison appears to have included migrants or emissaries, bringing southern Mississippian customs into a region with established local traditions. Such communities may have served as trade outposts, religious missions, marriage colonies, or political footholds. No single explanation fully accounts for them, and their relationships with local populations were probably complex. Cahokia's influence may also travel through games. Chunky stones found across wide areas suggest that the game becomes closely associated with Mississippian social life. A skilled player, carrying both reputation and ritual importance, could move between communities and attract large gatherings. Gambling, feasting, diplomacy, and political competition might surround these events. The spread of the game provides a shared cultural practice that connects people without requiring them to belong to one government. Ideas are the most difficult cargo to trace. Stories, songs, ceremonial knowledge, agricultural methods, political titles, and claims of ancestry leave no direct archaeological trail. Yet they may be more important than copper or shell. Cahokia's greatest export could have been a model of how society might be organized around platform mounds, plazas, maize surplus, sacred leadership, public ritual, and long-distance alliance. Later Mississippian centers across the southeast share many of these features, though they develop according to local histories rather than descending from one simple blueprint. At its height, Cahokia stands inside a web of relationships stretching across much of eastern North America. Its leaders can gather rare materials, its artisans can transform them, and its ceremonies can give them meaning. But networks depend on trust, safe travel, dependable harvests, and political stability. The same routes that bring prestige can carry rivals, disease, disturbing news, and competing ideas. The farther Cahokia's influence reaches, the more difficult it becomes to control. Behind the movement of beautiful objects lies a city filled not only with visitors and wealth, but with crowded neighborhoods where the benefits of continental power are distributed unevenly. Beyond the plazas and ceremonial mounds, Cahokia is a city of ordinary mornings. Smoke seeps through thatched roofs before sunrise. Families stir beside hearths that have gone cold during the night. Water must be carried, embers revived, grain ground, children fed, tools repaired, and fields reached before the heat settles over the floodplain. From a distance, the metropolis is a landscape of monuments. At ground level, it is a dense arrangement of houses, workshops, paths, and courtyards, and its greatness is built from routines so common that they rarely leave dramatic traces. Yet these routines keep the city alive. A typical house is small, rectangular, and framed by wooden posts sunk into the earth. Walls may be covered with woven mats, reeds, or clay mixed with plant material, while roofs are layered with thatch. The interior is dim. A central hearth provides heat and a place to cook, but smoke irritates eyes and lungs. Baskets, pottery vessels, sleeping mats, food stores, stone tools, and personal objects crowd the limited space. Houses are rebuilt often because post-decay in damp soil. Storms damage roofs, and fire is a constant risk. Some are intentionally burned when abandoned, perhaps for practical reasons, ritual closure, or both. Households are not isolated boxes. Many appear in clusters arranged around shared open areas where related families work and socialize. These groups may reflect kinship, origin, occupation, or allegiance. In a city filled with migrants, such clusters offer familiarity. A family from outside the American bottom can preserve cooking styles, pottery forms, and social ties while adapting to the wider Cahokian order. Differences between neighborhoods suggest that the metropolis never becomes completely uniform. What survives in the record points toward a patchwork of communities tied together by ceremony, labor, exchange, and dependence on the center. Daily work begins with food. Maize is soaked, boiled, pounded, or ground into meal. Grinding is repetitive and physically demanding, leaving wear on joints and teeth over years. Stews combine maize with squash, seeds, greens, fish, and meat. The timing and importance of beans at Cahokia remain debated. Pottery vessels sit over fires or among heated stones. Deer bones are cracked for marrow. Fish are cleaned near water or brought home in baskets. Nuts must be shelled and processed before storage. Food preparation consumes hours and depends heavily on labor that archaeology often renders anonymous. Children participate early. They carry water, gather fuel, watch younger siblings, scare animals from fields, and learn crafts by observing adults. Childhood is not separate from work, but neither is it without play. Small objects, miniature vessels, and open spaces hint at learning and recreation. Though identifying toys archaeologically is difficult, children grow up surrounded by crowds, strangers, and monuments that make Cahokia seem permanent. They also face high risks from infection, nutritional stress, accidents, and seasonal shortages. Many do not survive to adulthood. a reality common across the ancient world. Craft production gives neighbourhoods a distinct rhythm. Shell workers cut and polish imported material, leaving dust and fragments around work areas. Potters gather clay, add temper, shape vessels by hand, decorate surfaces, and fire them outdoors. Stoneworkers strike flakes from cores with blows precise enough to produce sharp edges without shattering valuable material. Woodworkers make posts, handles, bowls, masks, and tools that usually decay before archaeologists can find them. Textile production is even less visible, though people weave plant fibres, make cordage, prepare hides, and create clothing for summer heat and winter cold. Cahokia's streets are not paved roads, but repeated movement creates paths between houses, plazas, fields, water sources, and ceremonial spaces. During dry weather, dust rises. During rain, paths turn to mud. Waste accumulates around households despite efforts to discard it in pits. Broken pottery, animal bones, ash, plant remains, and human refuse attract insects and scavengers. Water quality becomes a serious problem wherever many people live close together. Wells or springs may supplement river water, but contamination remains difficult to avoid. Crowding brings cooperation while allowing disease to move more easily. Health evidence from burials reveals the cost of urban life. Some skeletons show anemia, infection, dental decay, healed fractures, and childhood stress. Heavy labour leaves marks on bones. Maize-rich diets can increase cavities and nutritional imbalance, especially when access to meat and varied plants is unequal. Women face childbirth's dangers, while everyone risks injury from tools, construction, hunting, or violence. Yet health is not uniformly poor. Some residents reach advanced ages, recover from serious wounds, and receive long-term care, showing that households support injured or disabled members. Social differences are visible in both life and death. Families near major mounds may enjoy better access to food, influence, and ceremonies. Elite households possess rare shell, copper, fine pottery, pigments, and imported materials. Others own mostly practical tools and local vessels. Some people may be servants, captives, or dependents with little control over where they live or work. Archaeology cannot easily distinguish poverty from cultural preference, and a small house is not automatically evidence of low status. Still, unequal burials and uneven access to prestige goods make clear that prosperity is not shared equally. The city creates release from labour. Crowds gather to watch chunky matches, ceremonies, dances, and processions. Feasts fill the air with smoke and cooking smells. Visitors bring news from distant communities. Courtship, gambling, storytelling, and music unfold in courtyards and open spaces. Humour, rivalry, affection, and boredom leave almost no trace, but they are as much a part of Cahokia as monuments. The people living here are not simply subjects or units of labour, they form friendships, grieve relatives, argue with neighbours, and imagine futures within a city that seems to stand at the centre of the world. Night changes the metropolis. Without artificial light, darkness gathers quickly beyond hearths and torches. Dogs bark between houses. Insects rise from wetlands. Fires flicker across neighbourhoods while the great mounds become black shapes against the stars. The central precinct may remain active during ceremonies, but most households close themselves against cold, animals, and strangers. The city that appears unified in daylight breaks into thousands of intimate circles of light. This daily world contains the hidden measure of Cahokia's success. A metropolis survives only while ordinary people continue planting, cooking, repairing, raising children, and trusting that the system around them will endure, but density magnifies every strain. A poor harvest affects more mouths. A polluted water source sickens more households. A political dispute can divide entire neighborhoods. Beneath the ceremonies and trade, tension is accumulating. And the same crowded life that gives Cahokia its energy may soon make its problems impossible to contain. The first signs of trouble do not arrive as a single disaster. They appear gradually. Scattered through the archaeological record, a defensive wall rebuilt several times, houses abandoned in one neighborhood while others remain occupied, injuries on human bones, declining access to distant materials, and changes in the way people bury their dead. None of these clues alone proves that Cahokia is entering crisis. Cities constantly rebuild, populations move, and violence exists even during prosperous periods. Taken together, however, they suggest that the metropolis is becoming harder to govern, harder to supply, and perhaps harder for its inhabitants to believe in. One of the clearest changes is the construction of a massive wooden palisade around the central ceremonial precinct. Thousands of upright logs form a barrier enclosing Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and nearby elite spaces. The wall includes regularly spaced bastions or projecting sections that may allow defenders to watch its exterior and respond to attack. Building it requires cutting an enormous number of trees, transporting heavy trunks, digging deep trenches, and coordinating labour on a scale comparable to mound construction. The palisade is rebuilt several times, indicating that it is not a brief experiment. It becomes a persistent feature of Cahokia's later landscape. Why the wall is built remains uncertain. The most direct explanation is defense against armed enemies. Cahokia's wealth and influence may attract rivals, while communities resentful of tribute, labor demands, or political expansion could threaten the center. Conflict between competing elite factions is also possible. Yet the palisade may serve more than a military purpose. It separates sacred and political space from ordinary neighborhoods, controlling who can enter the city's core and under what conditions. A boundary that protects rulers from outsiders can also protect them from their own population. The wall changes the meaning of Cahokia's center. Earlier, the great plazas may have emphasized gathering, openness, and shared participation. Now the most powerful spaces stand behind timber barriers. Access becomes narrower and more visible. Gates can be watched. Movement can be directed. Those inside the palisade occupy a protected world, while most residents remain outside. The physical separation may reflect growing inequality or fear, though scholars still debate whether the wall marks social tension, ritual enclosure, external danger, or all three at once. Violence appears elsewhere in less ambiguous forms. Some human remains show wounds caused by projectile points, blows, or sharp weapons. A number of injuries healed, meaning their victims survived attacks and lived afterward. Others may have been fatal. Mass burials and possible executions reveal organized killing, while settlements across the broader region show varying degrees of fortification and destruction. This does not mean Cahokia exists in a state of constant war. Most inhabitants probably experience long periods of ordinary life. Still, the ability of leaders to maintain peace may be weakening as competition intensifies. Political tension could emerge from the city's diversity. Cahokia's rapid growth brought together migrants with different origins, customs, and loyalties. During the metropolis's rise, Shared ceremonies and economic opportunity may have helped hold these communities together. Over time, however, neighborhood identities could become sources of division. Groups might compete for access to farmland, trade routes, ceremonial offices, or elite patronage. A poor harvest or disputed succession would sharpen those conflicts. Without written records, the names of factions are lost, but changing settlement patterns suggest that unity was never guaranteed. The political system may also struggle with inheritance. A charismatic founder can persuade people to follow a new religious vision or join an ambitious urban project. His or her descendants must maintain that authority without the same moment of transformation. If leadership depends partly on successful harvests, celestial order, military strength, and public generosity, repeated failures weaken its sacred image. Rival lineages may claim that the rulers have lost favor or that ceremonies are no longer effective. No single explanation fully accounts for Cahokia's decline, but disputes over legitimacy are common in societies where political and religious authority are closely joined. Inequality makes these disputes more dangerous. Elite households retain access to rare goods, better food, and protected ceremonial spaces, while ordinary families carry much of the burden of farming, construction, and resource collection. Migrants, captives, and dependent laborers may occupy especially vulnerable positions. During abundance, unequal systems can survive because enough benefits reach the wider population. During scarcity, the contrast between those who store surplus and those who go hungry becomes harder to accept. Archaeology cannot reveal exactly how residents felt about these differences. Yet the palisade's appearance suggests that trust alone may no longer be sufficient. Health pressures add another layer. Dense neighborhoods produce waste faster than the environment can absorb it. Waterways and shallow sources become contaminated. Parasites and infections spread more easily through crowded households. Smoke from indoor fires damages lungs. Repetitive labor wears down joints, while maize-heavy diets contribute to dental decay and nutritional deficiencies if other foods become scarce. Children are particularly vulnerable. Stress recorded in teeth and bones reflects episodes of illness or hunger during growth. Although linking those episodes to specific political events is difficult, the city's demand for wood becomes increasingly costly. Houses, palisades, cooking fires, tools, canoes, and ceremonial buildings consume trees continuously. Nearby forests are thinned, forcing residents to travel farther for fuel and construction material. Removing trees changes drainage and exposes soil to erosion. It may also reduce habitats for deer and other animals relied upon for food. The construction of the palisade alone requires thousands of logs, and each rebuilding renews the demand. Cahokia's greatest defensive structure may therefore deepen the environmental pressure it is meant to withstand. Agriculture also creates tension over land. Productive fields close to the city are limited, especially where wetlands, flood channels, and settlement areas interrupt the landscape. Repeated cultivation can exhaust particular soils, while expanding fields requires clearing more woodland. Farmers may move outward, increasing the distance between homes, crops, and storage. If nearby villages are expected to provide food to the center, political demands can strain relationships with communities that also need to support themselves. Trade networks may become less dependable as Cahokia's influence weakens. Rare materials continue to arrive, but changes in their quantity and distribution may reflect shifting alliances. Distant communities are not passive suppliers. They can redirect exchange toward rival centers, resist Cahokian demands, or develop their own ceremonial authority. The metropolis that once drew people and objects inward may find that its prestige no longer guarantees cooperation. Even Cahokia's monumental construction appears to slow. Earlier generations repeatedly enlarge mounds and reorganize public spaces with extraordinary energy. Later activity continues, but the pace and scale seem less intense. This could indicate declining population, reduced political authority, changing religious priorities, or a deliberate move away from massive communal projects. The evidence remains incomplete because many areas have been damaged or remain unexcavated. Still, a society that once expressed confidence by reshaping the earth begins to invest more visibly in barriers. There is no moment when all residents suddenly recognize that Cahokia is failing. Markets still function, crops are planted, ceremonies continue, children grow up within sight of Monk's Mound. The city may remain impressive long after its foundations begin to weaken. Civilizations often decline unevenly, with prosperity and insecurity existing side by side. At Cahokia, the palisade rises while feasts continue. Elite burials remain elaborate while neighborhoods thin, and sacred monuments still command the horizon even as the social world beneath them becomes increasingly fragile. Then forces beyond politics begin to press more heavily on the metropolis. The river changes, rainfall patterns shift, and the landscape that once made Cahokia possible becomes less predictable. Human tension has prepared the city for crisis, but climate and water will determine how severe that crisis becomes. The landscape that nourished Cahokia has always demanded respect. The American bottom is fertile because it is unstable, renewed by water that cannot be completely controlled. For generations, people live with seasonal floods, shifting channels, wet years, dry years, and the constant possibility that the Mississippi will move beyond familiar limits. During Cahokia's rise, this uncertainty is manageable because communities understand the floodplain and spread their risks across fields, wetlands, forests, lakes, and villages. As population grows, however, the metropolis becomes increasingly dependent on predictable harvests and a vast network of settlements. Environmental variation that once affected a few communities can now threaten tens of thousands of people at once. For many years, drought was considered one of the leading environmental explanations for Cahokia's decline. The argument seemed straightforward. Maize agriculture depends on adequate rainfall, and a prolonged dry period could reduce harvests, empty storage pits, increase competition, and weaken leaders who promised abundance. Tree ring records from parts of the central United States show episodes of severe drought during the centuries when Cahokia's population was falling. These dry intervals may have affected the city directly or damaged surrounding communities whose surplus supported the center. Yet climate patterns vary across regions, and the evidence does not show one uninterrupted drought severe enough to explain the entire decline. More recent research has drawn attention to the opposite threat: flooding. Sediment cores taken from lakes near the Mississippi preserve layers deposited when major floods carried unusual amounts of material across the floodplain. These records suggest that the region experienced a period of reduced flooding during Cahokia's rapid growth, followed by a return of larger flood events after the city had become densely populated. The timing is important. A long interval of relative stability may have encouraged settlement in low areas that appeared safe within living memory. When larger floods returned, the consequences would have been far more severe than they had been for earlier, smaller communities. A flood does not need to cover the entire city to create crisis. It can destroy fields shortly before harvest, contaminate water, wash away stored food, damage houses, strand travellers, and force displaced families into already crowded neighbourhoods. Wet conditions encourage mould and disease. Paths disappear beneath mud. Fish populations may briefly increase in some places, but agricultural losses can outweigh that benefit when maize has become central to survival. If floods occur repeatedly within a generation, rebuilding becomes exhausting. People begin to question whether homes, fields, and sacred structures stand in the right places. The Mississippi is not the only waterway affecting Cahokia. Smaller streams, wetlands, backwater lakes, and local drainage channels shape daily life throughout the American bottom. Clearing forests and modifying the ground may change how quickly rainwater moves across the landscape. Compacted plazas, borrow pits, mounds, roads, houses, and agricultural fields alter drainage in ways the builders may not fully anticipate. Water can collect in low areas, erode mound slopes, and turn residential zones into unhealthy marshes. The same urban construction that demonstrates control over nature may quietly make the city more vulnerable to it. Monk's Mound itself carries evidence of water's power. Its enormous mass contains different soils that absorb and release moisture unevenly. Heavy rains seep into internal layers, causing pressure, cracks, and slumping. Cahokia's builders repeatedly repair unstable sections, showing practical knowledge and persistence. Yet each repair demands labour and material at a time when the city may already be struggling to maintain houses, palisades, fields, and public ceremonies. A collapsing slope on the central monument would be more than an engineering problem. If the mound embodies sacred order, visible failure could become a political and religious crisis. Deforestation may intensify these pressures. Cahokia consumes immense quantities of timber, houses decay and must be rebuilt, cooking fires burn every day. Palisades require thousands of large logs and are replaced repeatedly. Ceremonial buildings, storage structures, tools, and canoes add to the demand. Nearby forests gradually thin, especially around the most densely occupied areas. Residents must travel farther to collect fuel and construction wood, increasing the time required for ordinary tasks. Removing trees also exposes soil, reduces shade, changes wildlife habitat, and may increase erosion into waterways. The scale of forest clearance remains debated. The region was not transformed into a barren wasteland, and woodland could regenerate in abandoned fields. Some earlier models portrayed Cahokia as destroying its environment in a simple, catastrophic process. But the evidence is more complicated. Indigenous communities possessed long experience with controlled burning, shifting cultivation, and the management of useful plants. The problem was not ignorance. It was the unprecedented concentration of demand. Practices sustainable for dispersed villages could become difficult when applied around a metropolis of thousands. Agricultural exhaustion may have followed a similar pattern. Floodplain soils can be extremely fertile, especially when replenished by sediment, but repeated maize cultivation removes nutrients and encourages weeds and pests. Farmers can respond by rotating fields, clearing new plots, planting complementary crops, or using household waste and organic material to enrich soil. These strategies require land and labour, as nearby farmland becomes crowded or unreliable. Cultivation shifts farther from the urban centre. The distance between field and household grows, making transport harder and crops more difficult to protect. Wild resources also feel the pressure. Deer retreat from heavily hunted zones. Firewood becomes scarce close to houses. Wetlands used repeatedly for fishing, bird hunting, and plant gathering may produce less during poor years. A diverse environment still surrounds Cahokia, but access becomes unequal. Powerful households or communities may claim the best fields and hunting territories, while others travel farther or depend more heavily on distributed food. Environmental stress, therefore, becomes social stress. A shortage is never experienced evenly. Climate change also affects distant regions connected to Cahokia. Drought on the plains can disrupt trade and migration. Flooding downstream can damage settlements supplying shell, salt, or ceremonial materials. Poor harvests in neighboring communities reduce the surplus available for feasts or tribute. Political alliances based on exchange become harder to maintain when every settlement protects its own stores. Cahokia's continental network, once a source of resilience, can transmit crisis across long distances. Some people may respond by leaving. A family facing repeated crop failure does not need to wait for the entire city to collapse. It can move to relatives in another settlement, seek higher ground, or join a community where land is more available. Migration may begin slowly, almost invisibly. One house is not rebuilt. A neighborhood loses several families. Fields near the city fall out of use. Fewer workers appear for construction. The remaining population carries a greater share of communal obligations, giving more people reasons to depart. Environmental hardship alone does not explain why Cahokia declines while other societies survive difficult climate episodes. Communities can adapt to floods, droughts, and depleted resources when political institutions remain trusted and flexible. Cahokia's difficulty is that environmental change arrives as social tensions are already increasing. Leaders must maintain ceremonies, fortifications, trade, and food distribution, while their resource base becomes less reliable. Measures intended to strengthen control may worsen resistance. Demands for more labor, tribute, or timber burden households already struggling with shortages. The evidence remains incomplete, and climate records cannot identify the exact year when a particular family abandoned its home. Nor can sediment layers reveal whether people blamed rulers, enemies, ancestors, or their own decisions. What they do show is that Cahokia's environment did not remain constant. The favourable conditions surrounding its rise eventually gave way to greater instability. Floods, droughts, erosion, resource pressure, and changing river behaviour acted not as one fatal blow, but as repeated tests of an increasingly fragile system. By the time the city begins to shrink, its people may no longer see the floodplain as the unquestioned centre of possibility. The great mounds remain, but the landscape around them has become harder to trust. Cahokia is not swept away in a single flood or starved by one drought. It is worn down by uncertainty, and every environmental shock deepens political doubts already gathering behind the palisade. The question is no longer whether the metropolis faces trouble, but why enough people finally decide that its sacred centre is no longer worth sustaining. Cahokia does not end with a final battle, a single flood, or one ruler's death. There is no burned layer stretching across the entire city, no written account describing panic, and no mass grave proving that the population was destroyed in one decisive catastrophe. Instead, the metropolis thins. Houses disappear from neighbourhoods that were once crowded. Major construction slows. Ceremonial spaces lose activity. Trade connections change. Families leave, and many do not return. By the 14th century, the central city that once dominated the Mississippi Valley is largely abandoned. Its mounds remain, but the social system that built and maintained them has dissolved. The mystery is not that people moved. Human communities have always relocated when conditions change. The mystery is why a city powerful enough to gather thousands of workers, attract migrants, and influence distant societies could no longer persuade its own population to stay. Early explanations often searched for one dramatic cause. Warfare seemed an obvious possibility. The palisade around Cahokia's central precinct suggested enemies gathering outside the city or conflict rising within it. Human remains with weapon injuries confirmed that violence occurred. Political rivals may have attacked the metropolis, while surrounding communities could have resisted Cahokian demands. Yet there is no clear evidence of a conquest that destroyed the entire settlement. Some neighborhoods were abandoned without burning. Monuments were not systematically demolished. If war contributed to the decline, it probably did so through repeated insecurity, disrupted travel, and political fragmentation, rather than one final invasion. Internal conflict may have been equally damaging. Cahokia's population included migrants, neighborhood communities, elite lineages, farmers, artisans, ritual specialists, and dependent laborers whose interests did not always align. The city's rapid rise may have depended on a powerful religious movement or an unusually effective coalition of leaders. Later generations inherited the institutions without necessarily inheriting the same legitimacy. Disputes over succession, ceremonial offices, land, tribute, or trade could divide the ruling class. A palisade enclosing the centre may reflect not only fear of external attack, but fear of the population living beyond its gates. The sacred character of authority makes political failure especially dangerous. Cahokia's leaders appear connected to harvests, seasonal renewal, feasts, monuments, and the ordering of the cosmos. If crops fail, floods damage sacred spaces, or ceremonies no longer seem effective. The problem is more than administrative. The ruler's relationship with supernatural forces can be questioned. People may conclude that leaders have lost power, violated obligations, or failed to protect the community. A system that once transformed successful harvests into evidence of sacred approval can transform disaster into evidence of sacred failure. Environmental explanations remain compelling but incomplete. Flooding may have damaged low-lying fields and settlements after a long period of relative stability. Drought may have reduced harvests during critical decades. Deforestation increased the cost of construction and fuel. Agricultural pressure forced farmers farther from the centre. Wildlife became less accessible near dense settlements. Water contamination and disease placed additional burdens on households. These stresses would make urban life increasingly difficult. But none alone required the complete abandonment of Cahokia. Communities elsewhere survived similar environmental challenges by changing crops, moving houses to higher ground, or reducing population density. That may be exactly what Cahokia's residents did. Abandonment should not be imagined as failure to adapt. Leaving may have been the adaptation. A household could move to a smaller village where land, firewood, and clean water were easier to obtain. Families might join relatives elsewhere, establish new settlements, or return to regions from which their ancestors had migrated. The collapse of the city does not mean the people vanished. It means they stopped investing labour in one concentrated centre. Disease has also been proposed as a cause, particularly because Cahokia's crowded neighbourhoods created conditions favourable to infection. Waste accumulated near homes, water could become contaminated, and migrants brought together populations with different histories of exposure. Illness may have weakened communities, especially during shortages. Yet there is no evidence for one epidemic comparable to those that devastated indigenous populations after European contact. Diseases moving through Cahokia were probably recurring local infections rather than a single newly introduced plague. Their effects would still be serious, but they form part of a wider pattern of stress. Another possibility is that Cahokia's political economy demanded too much. Monument construction, palisade rebuilding, public feasting, tribute, and elite ceremony all depended on household labour. During prosperous decades, these obligations may have created belonging and security. During difficult years, they could become intolerable. Farmers facing reduced harvests may resist surrendering surplus. Communities farther from the centre may withdraw support. Workers may refuse to rebuild monuments whose benefits flow mainly to elites. Archaeology rarely preserves refusal directly, but the slowing of construction and dispersal of population may record a quiet rejection of centralized demands. The city's trade network could not simply compensate for these problems. Cahokia's influence depended on relationships rather than absolute control. Distant communities could redirect copper, shell, stone, and ceremonial goods toward other centers. Local leaders elsewhere may have adopted Cahokian practices while rejecting Cahokian authority. As regional societies became more powerful, the metropolis lost its unique position. The ideas Cahokia helped spread may have made it less necessary. New mound centers emerged across the southeast and Mississippi Valley, each capable of organizing its own ceremonies, alliances, and exchange. Religious change may also have encouraged departure. Cahokia's monuments embodied a particular vision of society, but beliefs are not fixed. New rituals, new leaders, or disappointment with old institutions could weaken the city's attraction. Some mounds may have remained sacred even after permanent residence declined. People could visit, remember ancestors, or perform ceremonies without sustaining a dense urban population. A place can remain spiritually powerful while losing political centrality. The decline probably unfolded unevenly over more than a century. Population began decreasing after Cahokia's peak, but some districts remained occupied longer than others. Leaders still organized construction and burial ceremonies after the first signs of contraction. The city did not move smoothly from greatness to emptiness. There were periods of rebuilding, adjustment, and perhaps temporary recovery. One generation may have believed the crisis had passed, only for the next to face renewed flooding, conflict, or shortage. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeological dates rarely identify changes precisely enough to reconstruct every turn. No single explanation fully accounts for Cahokia's abandonment, because the causes likely reinforced one another. Environmental instability reduced food security, shortages sharpened inequality, political conflict weakened coordinated responses, defensive construction consumed timber and labour, migration reduced the workforce and tax base, making communal obligations heavier for those who remained. Declining prestige weakened trade, while weaker trade made ceremonies less impressive. Each problem made the others harder to solve. Eventually, a threshold was crossed. The city no longer offered enough protection, opportunity, or sacred certainty to justify its costs. People departed not as one fleeing crowd, but as families making separate decisions. A roof collapsed and was not rebuilt. A field returned to weeds. A neighborhood path faded beneath grass. Ceremonies gathered fewer participants. The great plazas became quieter, though Monk's Mound still rose above the floodplain exactly as it had before. Cahokia's abandonment was therefore not the disappearance of a people, but the end of a particular arrangement of people. The metropolis failed to endure, yet its inhabitants carried their knowledge, memories, symbols, and relationships elsewhere. To understand what happened after the city emptied, the search must move beyond the mounds and follow those survivors into the wider indigenous world. When the last densely occupied neighborhoods around Cahokia fall quiet, the people do not dissolve into the floodplain. They move. Some travel only a short distance, settling on higher ground or joining smaller communities along nearby rivers. Others follow kinship ties far beyond the American bottom. Families carry seeds, tools, ceremonial knowledge, stories, pottery traditions, and memories of the great mounds. Children born after the departure may never see Monk's Mound, yet they grow up among adults who remember crowded plazas, timber walls, public feasts, and the exhausting labor of maintaining a city. Cahokia disappears as a metropolis, but its people remain part of the living indigenous world of North America. Archaeology traces this dispersal imperfectly. Pottery styles change, settlements relocate, and regional traditions emerge from combinations of older Cahokian practices and local customs. In some places, communities become smaller and more scattered. Elsewhere, new mound centers rise, especially farther south and east. These later societies do not simply copy Cahokia, they develop their own political systems, ceremonial traditions, artistic styles, and responses to local environments. Still, certain features remain familiar: platform mounds, central plazas, maize agriculture, public feasting, sacred leadership, chunky, shell engraving, and symbols linking sky, earth, water, warfare, fertility, and ancestry. The broad archaeological tradition known as Mississippian continues for centuries after Cahokia's decline. Powerful centers flourish at places such as Moundville in present-day Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, and numerous towns throughout the southeast and lower Mississippi Valley. Some were already developing while Cahokia remained occupied. Others grew later, within a world transformed by the ideas and networks the metropolis had helped intensify. Whether migrants from Cahokia directly founded particular centers is difficult to prove. Objects and building styles can travel without mass migration, while people can move without preserving every feature of their former lives. The evidence remains incomplete, but Cahokia's decline clearly did not end the wider Mississippian world. Communities leaving the city may also have rejected parts of its system. Dispersal was not necessarily an attempt to rebuild Cahokia elsewhere. Some survivors may have abandoned extreme political centralization, large labor demands, or the ceremonial authority associated with the old metropolis. Smaller towns could offer more direct access to farmland, water, and local leadership. Kin groups might prefer communities where obligations were negotiated nearby rather than imposed from a distant mound summit. In this sense, the end of Cahokia may have produced not cultural collapse, but political experimentation. Identifying the descendants of Cahokia's inhabitants is far more complicated than assigning an ancient site to one modern nation. The metropolis was already diverse, drawing migrants from different regions and probably containing speakers of more than one language. Its population dispersed over generations and entered communities that later divided, merged, moved, and formed new political identities. European colonization then caused warfare, forced migration, epidemic disease, land loss, and the destruction of many records, A straight line from Cahokia to a single present-day people would ignore this history. Several indigenous nations have cultural, historical, or geographic connections to the broader Mississippian world, including peoples whose ancestors spoke Siouan, Caddoan, Muskogean, and other languages. Nations such as the Osage, Quapaw, Omaha, Ponca, Kaw, and Dageha speaking peoples have traditions and histories connected to migrations through the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. The Illinois peoples later lived in the region around Cahokia, while numerous southeastern nations inherited political and ceremonial traditions shaped within the wider Mississippian landscape. None of these relationships should be reduced to a simple claim that one nation alone built the city. What survives in the records suggests a far more entangled ancestry. Oral traditions deserve particular care. For generations, historians treated archaeology as reliable while dismissing indigenous memory as myth. That division is misleading. Oral histories can preserve migrations, sacred geography, conflicts, alliances, and relationships to ancient places, though they do not function like written chronological records. Stories change as they are transmitted because their purpose is not merely to list events. They explain identity, moral responsibility, kinship, and the meaning of landscapes. When oral traditions and archaeology are considered together, Cahokia becomes less isolated from later indigenous history. At the same time, researchers must avoid forcing every story into a direct explanation of one archaeological site. A tradition recorded centuries later may contain layers from different periods and communities. Similar motifs can occur across wide regions without referring to the same event. Scholars still debate how particular migration accounts relate to Cahokia, and indigenous nations differ in how they understand the site. The uncertainty is not a reason to disregard oral knowledge. It is a reason to approach it respectfully and without demanding that it conform perfectly to archaeological categories. The city's physical remains likely continue to shape memory after its abandonment. Monk's Mound did not disappear when the summit buildings decayed. Travellers moving through the region saw an artificial mountain rising above the floodplain. Smaller mounds formed recognizable clusters across grassland and woodland. Some may have remained places of ceremony, burial, visitation, or warning. Others were reinterpreted by later communities whose ancestors had not lived in the metropolis. Ancient monuments often gather new meanings as populations change around them. Objects may have carried memory more intimately. A shell ornament inherited within a family, a chunky stone moved to a new settlement, or a pottery design taught across generations could preserve connections without explaining them openly. Agricultural knowledge travelled in the same way. Maize varieties, planting schedules, food preparation, storage methods, and floodplain management were carried by people whose movements left few obvious traces. The most important survival may therefore lie not in monumental imitation, but in ordinary practices repeated after the city was gone. Political lessons may also have endured. Later Mississippian towns often combined ceremonial centers with surrounding villages, but few recreated Cahokia's immense concentration of population. This difference may reflect environmental limits, regional history, or deliberate choices. A city of Cahokia's size offered prestige and power, yet it also produced crowding, inequality, dependence, and vulnerability. Communities living in the shadow of its failure may have remembered that concentration carries danger, even when the archaeological record cannot preserve such reflections. By the 16th century, European expeditions entering the southeast encountered large indigenous towns with mounds, plazas, temples, fields, and complex leadership. These societies were not frozen remnants of Cahokia. They were dynamic nations with centuries of history after the metropolis declined. European observers often misunderstood what they saw, describing indigenous political systems through their own assumptions about kings, nobles, religion, and property. Soon afterward, disease, violence, slave raiding, and colonial disruption devastated many of these communities, making the deeper connections even harder to reconstruct. The disappearance of Cahokia was later used to support a false story that North America before European colonization was sparsely inhabited, politically simple, and untouched by urban life. To sustain that story, the city's builders had to be separated from living indigenous peoples. The mounds were attributed to a vanished race, foreign travelers, or imaginary civilizations because many settlers refused to believe that Native Americans had created them. This was not an innocent mistake. It helped justify the seizure of indigenous land by suggesting that its true builders had already disappeared. The people of Cahokia did not vanish. Their descendants survived through change, displacement, adaptation, and colonial catastrophe. Even though archaeology cannot assign every line of descent with certainty, the city belongs within indigenous history, not outside it. Its abandonment marks the end of one political centre, not the end of the societies that gave it life. The mounds remained while memories were scattered among many communities and repeatedly interrupted by violence. Centuries later, outsiders would encounter those earthworks and invent mysteries to avoid the most direct explanation. Cahokia had been built by indigenous Americans whose achievements challenged the history the new nation wished to tell about itself. For centuries after Cahokia's central neighborhoods emptied, the mounds remained visible across the Mississippi floodplain. They were too large to be mistaken for ordinary hills, yet their true history became increasingly obscured as colonial settlement transformed the region. Forests were cleared, fields ploughed, roads cut through ancient neighborhoods, and expanding towns consumed the edges of the archaeological landscape. Some mounds were flattened for construction, others were dug into for soil, levelled beneath farms, or damaged by railways and highways. The city that had once dominated the valley did not disappear naturally beneath untouched wilderness. Much of it was dismantled gradually by people who did not understand or did not value what lay beneath their feet. European settlers encountered large earthen monuments throughout eastern North America, and many refused to accept that indigenous peoples had built them. This disbelief grew into the so-called mound builder myth, the idea that an unknown and supposedly vanished civilization had created the earthworks before being destroyed or displaced by Native Americans. Proposed builders included Vikings, Egyptians, Israelites, Phoenicians, Hindus, refugees from Atlantis, and members of an imagined lost white race. The theories contradicted abundant evidence, but they satisfied a powerful colonial assumption that indigenous nations were incapable of complex engineering, long-distance exchange, large settlements, or organized government. The myth served more than curiosity. If the builders were imagined as foreigners who had vanished, settlers could claim that the land's true civilization had disappeared before European arrival. Indigenous peoples would then be portrayed as recent intruders rather than descendants of the continent's ancient societies. This false narrative helped turn dispossession into a story of restoration. The removal of native nations from their homelands could be justified as the return of civilization to a landscape supposedly abandoned by its original creators. Archaeological fantasy became politically useful. Some early observers recognized that Native Americans had built the mounds, but their conclusions competed with popular prejudice. Excavations were often destructive and poorly recorded. Burial mounds were opened for objects rather than studied carefully, and human remains were displayed or collected without consent. Artifacts entered private cabinets and museums, separated from the locations and communities that gave them meaning. At Cahokia, farming repeatedly cut through house floors and burial areas, while urban development destroyed parts of the wider settlement before archaeologists could document them. One of the most dramatic losses occurred in nearby St. Louis, once surrounded by so many indigenous earthworks that it became known as the Mound City. Nearly all of those mounds were demolished as the modern city expanded. They were leveled for streets, buildings, and industry, erasing a major part of the regional network connected to Cahokia. What survives today is therefore not the complete ancient metropolis, but a fragment of a much larger ceremonial and residential landscape that once extended across both sides of the Mississippi. Systematic archaeology slowly changed the understanding of Cahokia. Excavations revealed house patterns, plazas, fortifications, workshops, burials, and repeated construction beneath the visible mounds. Researchers began to recognize that the site was not simply a ceremonial gathering place visited occasionally by scattered tribes. It had supported a substantial permanent population, contained specialized districts, and organized labor on an urban scale. Monk's Mound was not a natural hill modified slightly by later occupants. It was an enormous artificial platform created through planned stages of construction. The scale of the discovery forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about North American history. Cahokia had reached its height centuries before several famous European capitals became dominant. At its peak, it may have held a population comparable to or larger than many cities elsewhere in the world at the time. It possessed no stone architecture, wheeled transport, metal tools, or written bureaucracy. Yet it coordinated immense public works and maintained continental networks of exchange. Its existence demonstrated that cities do not need to follow one technological path or resemble Europe and the Mediterranean to qualify as complex urban centers. Even the word civilization becomes uncomfortable when applied selectively. For generations, textbooks used the term confidently for societies with palaces, kings, armies, writing, and stone monuments, while presenting indigenous North America as a collection of small, wandering communities. Cahokia exposes the limits of that framework. Its people built from earth and wood because those materials suited their environment and traditions, not because they lacked intelligence or ambition. The disappearance of wooden architecture does not make it less monumental. The absence of written records does not mean the society had no history. Public awareness, however, developed slowly. Many Americans grew up learning about ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, and the Maya without hearing that a vast metropolis had once stood near the Mississippi. Cahokia remained physically close to highways, suburbs, and one of the country's major urban regions, yet it occupied little space in the national imagination. This absence was not caused only by poor preservation. It reflected a historical tradition that treated indigenous achievement as peripheral to the story of the United States. Recognition of the site eventually increased. Preservation efforts protected the central mound complex, and Cahokia became a state historic site, and later a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Museums and reconstructed features helped visitors visualize a landscape once filled with houses, timber circles, plazas, and processions. Archaeological methods improved, using soil chemistry, botanical remains, isotope analysis, remote sensing. and careful excavation to recover information that earlier researchers missed. Each new technique added detail while also revealing how much had already been destroyed. Modern interpretation increasingly involves consultation with indigenous nations, though this work remains incomplete. Cahokia is not only an archaeological resource or tourist destination, it contains burials, sacred spaces, and the remains of ancestors. Questions about excavation, museum display, reburial, site management, and public storytelling involve ethical responsibilities as well as scientific interest. Descendant communities are not simply sources of folklore added after the research is finished. Their knowledge and perspectives can reshape the questions scholars ask and challenge assumptions built into older archaeology. Popular myths have not entirely disappeared. Claims that Cahokia was founded by outsiders, guided by lost advanced technology, or connected to unsupported global civilizations continue to circulate. Such theories often present themselves as daring alternatives to academic orthodoxy, yet they usually repeat the same old refusal to credit indigenous people with their own achievements. The genuine mystery of Cahokia does not require imaginary visitors from distant continents. Its unanswered questions are more compelling because they concern real human choices: how authority formed, why migrants came, how sacred power operated, and why people eventually left. Cahokia's greatest challenge to conventional history is not simply that a large city existed, where many were taught no city could exist. It is that the metropolis followed a path distinct from familiar old-world models. It rose rapidly without writing, concentrated power without stone palaces, organized trade without coinage, and reshaped the landscape without metal machinery. Its people created urban life according to their own knowledge, cosmology, environment, and political ambitions. The site now stands between modern roads and open fields, its surviving mounds covered in grass. Visitors climbing Monk's Mound can look toward the skyline of St. Louis, where another city rises across the river. Beneath that view lies a deeper one. Cities are never inevitable, and no society owns the idea of complexity. Cahokia remains because enough earth survived the plough and the bulldozer to contradict a national forgetting. Its builders were never a vanished race. They were indigenous people of North America, and the metropolis they raised still alters the history told about the continent. The evening light settles over the American bottom, softening the hard edges of the modern landscape. Traffic moves along distant roads. Power lines cross ground where houses once stood in dense rows. The Mississippi continues past the floodplain, carrying silt, branches, rainwater, and the reflections of another century. Above it all, Monk's Mound remains, broad and quiet, no longer crowned by a timber hall or surrounded by thousands of voices. Grass covers the terraces. Wind moves across the summit. From a distance, it looks almost natural, as though the earth raised itself. But the mound is not natural. Every part of it is the memory of human effort. Beneath its slopes are millions of baskets of soil, each carried by someone whose name is gone. Farmers, builders, migrants, craftspeople, children, leaders, and captives all pass through the city's world. They planted maize in dark floodplain soils, watched the sun rise beside timber posts, gathered in plazas, played games, buried their dead, endured floods, and made decisions about whether to remain or leave. Cahokia was not a mystery because its people were unknowable. It was a mystery because so little of their world survived the forces that followed. The city's disappearance offers no single lesson. It does not prove that urban life must fail, that environmental damage alone destroys civilizations, or that every powerful society collapses through violence. Cahokia declined through a combination of pressures, choices, and changing conditions that cannot be separated neatly. Its inhabitants did not simply wait for disaster. They adapted, dispersed, rebuilt elsewhere, and carried fragments of the metropolis into new communities. The center vanished, but the people continued. That may be the most important image Cahokia leaves behind. Civilizations are not only monuments, they are agreements maintained from day-to-day agreements about who belongs, who works, who receives, who leads, and what the landscape means. When those agreements weaken, even the largest plazas grow quiet. Yet memory can survive in forms more durable than walls in traditions. Roots, crops, ceremonies, and descendants who continue despite displacement and loss. As darkness gathers over the mound, the modern skyline glows beyond the river. Two cities face one another across time, one built from steel and concrete, the other from wood and earth. The newer city seems permanent. The older one once did too. Between them, the Mississippi keeps moving, indifferent to names, carrying the past beneath its surface while the great mound waits in silence.